I'm standing in my hotel room at 2 a.m., staring at what used to be my dream wedding dress, now lying in tatters on the bathroom floor. The custom silk bodice has been sliced clean through with scissors, the hand-sewn pearls scattered across the marble tiles like tiny broken promises. My hands are shaking so violently I can barely hold my phone, but I manage to dial my attorney's emergency line. When he answers, groggy and confused, I speak with a clarity that surprises even me. "Richard, I need you to remove Michael from my will. All of it. Tonight." The silence on the other end stretches for what feels like an eternity before he whispers, "What happened?" I look down at the $5,000 dress that took 8 months to create, the dress I dreamed of wearing since I was a little girl, and I feel something inside me break. Not my heart. That had been breaking for 3 years, but something deeper. My tolerance. My willingness to be a victim. Let me take you back to how this nightmare began, because this story isn't really about a wedding dress. It's about a woman named Patricia Hartwell who believed she owned her son, and, by extension, owned me. Michael and I met during our senior year at Northwestern, both of us studying business, both of us from what you'd call comfortable backgrounds. What I didn't know then was that Patricia had already decided no woman would ever be good enough for her precious boy, and she'd made it her life's mission to prove that point. The first time Michael brought me home to their sprawling colonial in Winnetka, Patricia greeted me at the door with a smile so cold it could have frozen Lake Michigan. She looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe, then turned to Michael and said, "I suppose she'll do for dinner." That should have been my first red flag, but I was 21 and desperately in love with a man who seemed perfect in every way except one. He couldn't see how toxic his mother truly was. During that first dinner, Patricia made it clear that she'd researched my entire family history. She knew my father was a high school principal, my mother worked as a nurse, and that we lived in what she called one of those modest little neighborhoods outside Chicago. She peppered me with questions disguised as polite conversation. "Oh, how quaint that your parents met at a community college dance. I suppose not everyone can attend elite institutions like Michael did." When I mentioned my scholarship to Northwestern, she practically purred. "How wonderful that they have programs for students like you." Every comment was delivered with that same frigid smile, each word carefully chosen to remind me that I didn't belong in their world of country clubs and charity galas. Michael sat there through it all, occasionally squeezing my hand under the table, but never once defending me or telling his mother to back off. That night, as he drove me back to campus, he apologized but explained that his mother was just protective and that she'd warm up to me eventually. 3 years later, I'm still waiting for that warmth. The engagement itself became Patricia's personal battlefield. When Michael proposed on Christmas Eve at his family's annual party, I should have been overjoyed. Instead, I watched Patricia's face transform from surprise to barely concealed rage in the span of seconds. She didn't congratulate us. She didn't even speak to me for the rest of the evening. Instead, she spent the night whispering to relatives about how sudden everything was, how Michael was throwing his life away, and how she'd always imagined someone more suitable for her son. The next morning, she called Michael in tears, claiming she was having chest pains and needed him to come over immediately. When we rushed to her house, we found her perfectly fine, but demanding to know why he hadn't discussed the engagement with her first. "A mother should be consulted about such important decisions," she sobbed, clutching his arm like a drowning woman. "I've sacrificed everything for you, Michael. Everything. And this is how you repay me." I watched my fiancé crumble under the weight of her manipulation, promising to involve her in every aspect of our wedding planning. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just marrying Michael, I was marrying Patricia too. The wedding planning became a year-long psychological torture session. Patricia inserted herself into every single decision, from the venue to the flowers to the guest list. She'd call vendors behind my back to change orders, claiming she was helping because she had better taste and more experience with quality. When I chose a beautiful outdoor venue overlooking Lake Michigan, she booked a different location without telling me, then called crying about how much money she'd already put down as a surprise gift. She criticized my choice of bridesmaids, my floral arrangements, even the wording on our invitations. "Surely you don't mean to use such casual language for a formal affair," she'd say, rewriting everything to sound more like a legal document than a celebration of love. Michael always took her side, explaining that she was just trying to help and that I should be grateful for her experience. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, I was painted as the ungrateful daughter-in-law who didn't appreciate all the sacrifices Patricia was making for our happiness. But the dress was supposed to be mine. That was the one thing I'd claimed from the beginning, the one aspect of the wedding where I'd drawn a line in the sand. I'd gone to the most exclusive bridal boutique in Chicago, spent months working with their designer to create something absolutely perfect. The dress was a masterpiece of silk mikado with a sweetheart neckline, a fitted bodice covered in hand-sewn pearls that caught the light like stars, and a cathedral train that flowed behind me like liquid moonlight. It cost more than my parents' car, but it was worth every penny because it made me feel like the bride I'd always dreamed of being. I'd kept it secret from everyone except my maid of honor, storing it at the boutique until the morning of the wedding. Patricia had tried countless times to weasel information about it out of me, offering to help with alterations or suggesting we coordinate with the bridesmaids' dresses, but I'd held firm. This was mine. This was the one thing she couldn't control, manipulate, or destroy. Or so I thought, until I found myself staring at the destroyed remains of my dreams scattered across a hotel bathroom floor, finally understanding that Patricia Hartwell would literally destroy anything, even her son's happiness, to maintain control over her carefully constructed world. What I didn't know during those months of wedding planning was that Patricia had been conducting her own investigation into my background, and what she discovered had sent her into a rage that would make a tornado look like a gentle breeze. You see, my parents had been more than just modest middle-class Americans trying to give their daughter a good life. My father, Robert Thompson, had been playing a very long game with his investments, quietly building a portfolio that would make most people's heads spin. My mother, despite her humble job as a nurse, came from old money, not flashy, new rich money like the Hartwells, but the kind of quiet, established wealth that doesn't need to prove itself with designer handbags and country club memberships. They taught me the value of hard work and humility, never flaunting what we had, never making money the center of our conversations. I'd grown up thinking we were just a regular family, comfortable but not wealthy, because that's how my parents wanted it. They believed in earning respect through character, not through the size of your bank account. The truth was, I was worth more than Michael and Patricia combined, and she'd somehow found out. I later learned that she'd hired a private investigator to dig into my family's finances, probably hoping to find something scandalous she could use to break us up. Instead, she discovered that the modest little family she'd been condescending to for 3 years had assets that dwarfed the Hartwell fortune. My grandfather had been one of the original investors in several tech companies that had exploded in value over the decades. My parents owned property in 5 different states, had investment accounts that could fund a small nation, and had been quietly donating millions to charity every year. The woman who'd spent years making snide comments about my scholarship background and quaint upbringing had just realized she'd been insulting someone whose family could buy and sell hers without breaking a sweat. The irony was delicious, but Patricia's reaction was pure venom. The harassment escalated dramatically after Patricia's discovery. She began showing up at my apartment unannounced, sometimes as early as 6 a.m., claiming she needed to discuss important wedding details that couldn't wait. She'd rifle through my mail when I wasn't looking, comment on my furniture choices, and ask pointed questions about my family's sudden generosity with wedding expenses. She started calling my office multiple times a day, interrupting important meetings to discuss flower arrangements or seating charts that had already been finalized. When I blocked her number, she'd use Michael's phone to call me, then hand it to him mid-conversation, forcing me to choose between hanging up on my fiancé or enduring another one of her psychological attacks. She enlisted Michael's sister Sarah to spy on me, asking her to report back on my conversations, my friends, even my shopping habits. Every aspect of my life became fair game for Patricia's surveillance and criticism, and Michael either couldn't see it or chose not to acknowledge what was happening. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding, during what was supposed to be a peaceful brunch, to finalize the seating arrangements. Patricia had insisted on hosting at her country club, claiming it would be more civilized than meeting at my apartment. She'd invited several of her society friends, ostensibly to help with the planning, but really to serve as her audience for what turned out to be a masterclass in public humiliation. In front of 8 women I'd never met, Patricia began questioning every decision I'd made, from the choice of ceremony music to the design of the wedding favors. "I just think," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "that someone from your background might not understand the expectations of a wedding at this level." She went on to suggest that maybe I should have chosen a more appropriate venue, something that would better match my natural style code for something cheaper and less prestigious. When I tried to defend my choices, she smiled that Arctic smile and said, "Oh, darling, I'm not criticizing. I'm just trying to help you avoid embarrassing yourself in front of our friends and family." That was the moment I realized Patricia would never stop. She'd found her weapon, my supposed inferior background, and she was going to use it to demolish my confidence, my relationship with Michael, and my place in their family. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed I was weak, that I'd continue to absorb her abuse indefinitely because I was so desperate to belong to their world. What she didn't understand was that I'd never needed their world. I'd simply wanted to be part of it because I loved her son. The distinction was everything. When she stood up from that brunch table and announced to her friends that she was going to have a little chat with the bride about realistic expectations, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. I was done being the victim in Patricia Hartwell's sick game, and I was about to show her exactly what happened when you pushed someone who had nothing left to lose. The final straw came the day before the wedding when Patricia called me at my office, hysterical with what she claimed was devastating news. "I've just spoken with the florist," she sobbed into the phone, "and there's been a terrible mistake with the flower order. Everything is wrong. The colors, the arrangements, everything. The wedding will be ruined unless we act quickly." She insisted I needed to come to her house immediately to discuss emergency alternatives and wouldn't take no for an answer. When I arrived, exhausted from a full day of work and last-minute wedding preparations, I found Patricia in her living room with several large floral arrangements that looked absolutely perfect. "I took the liberty of ordering replacements," she said, gesturing to the flowers with a triumphant smile. "I know you'll agree that these are much more appropriate for the occasion. The other arrangements were just so pedestrian." As I stood there, staring at the arrangements that were completely different from what I'd spent months planning, I realized this wasn't about flowers at all. This was about control, about power, about putting me in my place one final time before her son became my husband. She'd manufactured a crisis to force me to accept her help, to make me grateful for her interference, to ensure that even on my wedding day, she'd be the one calling the shots. That's when everything changed. I looked at Patricia Hartwell, really looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't see the intimidating society matron who'd been making my life hell. I saw a desperately insecure woman who was so terrified of losing control over her son that she'd spend thousands of dollars on flowers just to prove she could override my decisions. I saw someone so threatened by my existence that she'd hired a private investigator to dig into my family's finances, only to discover that everything she'd used to belittle me was a lie. I saw a woman who was about to lose the only thing that gave her life meaning, her role as the most important woman in Michael's world, and she was willing to destroy his happiness to prevent that from happening. In that moment of clarity, I made a decision that would change everything. I smiled at Patricia, the first genuine smile I'd given her in years, and said, "You know what? You're absolutely right. These flowers are much more appropriate. In fact, they're perfect for the wedding you deserve." The confusion that flickered across her face was priceless, but she recovered quickly, assuming she'd finally broken me into submission. What Patricia didn't know was that I'd already been planning my own insurance policy. 3 months earlier, after the country club humiliation, I'd quietly hired my own attorney and had him draw up a comprehensive will. As someone with significant assets of my own, plus the inheritance I'd eventually receive from my parents, I wanted to make sure everything was properly documented. I'd originally planned to add Michael as the primary beneficiary after our marriage, but Patricia's escalating behavior had made me reconsider. I'd instructed my lawyer to create 2 versions, one that included Michael as my heir and another that excluded him entirely. The decision of which one to execute would depend on how his family treated me. I'd hoped I'd never need the second version, but Patricia was about to make that choice for me. I also had something else Patricia didn't know about, a recording app on my phone that I'd started using during our conversations. It had become a habit after she'd begun denying things she'd said or twisting my words when talking to Michael. I had hours of recordings of her verbal abuse, her manipulation tactics, and her threats. Evidence that would prove everything if anyone ever questioned my decisions. I left Patricia's house that evening with her replacement flowers, but I also left with something much more valuable, absolute certainty about what I needed to do. I drove straight to my hotel, where I was staying the night before the wedding according to tradition. My maid of honor, Jessica, was already there with my dress, which we'd picked up from the boutique that afternoon. The gown was even more beautiful than I'd remembered, hanging in the closet like a promise of happiness to come. Jessica was bubbling with excitement, talking about the ceremony, the reception, how perfect everything was going to be. I let her chatter while I sat on the bed, staring at my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found my attorney's number. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked, finally noticing my silence. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at how accurate that description was. I had seen a ghost, the ghost of the woman I used to be, the woman who would have accepted Patricia's flower sabotage with a grateful smile and a thank you note. That woman was gone forever. At around 10 p.m., I told Jessica I needed some alone time to prepare mentally for the next day, which was partially true. What I really needed was time to make some phone calls and finalize some plans. After Jessica left for her own room, I called my parents and had a long, honest conversation about Patricia's behavior and my concerns about the marriage. They'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to interfere with my decisions. When I told them about the private investigator and the financial harassment, my father's voice turned cold as steel. "Sweetheart," he said, "you don't have to marry anyone. You don't owe anyone your happiness, no matter how much money has been spent or how many people are coming to the wedding. If you're having doubts, we'll support whatever decision you make." My mother added, "We raised you to be strong and independent. Don't let anyone make you forget who you are." Their support gave me the courage I needed to make the next call to my attorney. I explained the situation and asked him to have the second version of my will ready for execution. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Once this is done, it can't be undone easily." I told him I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. But I still wasn't prepared for what happened next. Around midnight, I heard someone using a key card to enter my hotel room. I assumed it was Jessica, maybe returning for something she'd forgotten, but when I called out, there was no response. I crept toward the living area of the suite and found Patricia standing in the middle of the room, holding a large pair of fabric scissors and staring at my wedding dress hanging in the closet. The look on her face was pure rage mixed with something that looked almost like madness. "Patricia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" She turned toward me, and I could see tears streaming down her face, but her expression was harder than I'd ever seen it. "I won't let you destroy my family," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I won't let you take my son away from me. You think you're so special with your money and your fancy education, but you're nothing. You're nobody. And after tomorrow, Michael will see exactly what kind of person you really are." That's when she turned back toward the closet, raised the scissors, and began systematically destroying the most beautiful thing I'd ever owned. I stood there frozen, watching 3 years of abuse culminate in this moment of pure, vindictive destruction, and I felt something inside me snap. Not break, snap. Like a rubber band that had been stretched too far and finally found its natural tension again. I let her finish. I stood there in complete silence and watched Patricia Hartwell slice through every seam, cut every pearl from its thread, and reduce my dream dress to ribbons of silk and scattered beadwork. When she was done, she turned to me with this triumphant smile, like she'd just won some great victory. "Now," she said, breathing heavily from the exertion, "let's see how special you feel walking down the aisle in whatever cheap backup dress you can find at 1 a.m. Maybe this will teach you some humility." She actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and headed toward the door. But I stepped in front of her, blocking her path, and when I spoke, my voice was steady as bedrock. "Patricia," I said, pulling out my phone, "I want you to know that you've just made the easiest decision of my life." I showed her the screen, where my attorney's contact was already dialed. "You see, I've been recording our conversations for months. Every insult, every manipulation, every threat. And now I have video evidence of you breaking into my hotel room and destroying my property. That's breaking and entering, criminal mischief, and harassment." The color drained from her face as she realized what I was telling her. "You're going to listen very carefully to what happens next." I pressed call and put the phone on speaker. When Richard answered, I spoke clearly and calmly. "Richard, it's Emma. I need you to execute the second version of my will immediately. Remove Michael Hartwell as beneficiary and replace him with the charity provisions we discussed. Also, I need you to contact the police about a break-in and property destruction at the Fairmont Hotel and prepare a restraining order against Patricia Hartwell." I could see Patricia's legs actually start to shake as the reality of the situation hit her. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'll need you to contact Michael first thing in the morning to inform him that the wedding is canceled and that any financial obligations related to the ceremony will need to be handled by his family. I'll be returning to my parents' house, and I don't want any contact from the Hartwell family moving forward." Richard confirmed everything, professional as always, and told me he'd have the papers ready for my signature within the hour. I hung up and looked at Patricia, who was now leaning against the wall for support. "You wanted to know what kind of person I really am?" I asked. "I'm the kind of person who doesn't let anyone destroy her life twice." What happened next was the most satisfying moment of my entire relationship with the Hartwell family. Patricia, faced with the reality of losing her son's inheritance and facing criminal charges, completely fell apart. She started crying, not the manipulative tears I'd seen so many times before, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. "You can't do this," she kept repeating. "Michael loves you. He needs you. I was just trying to protect him." I was just trying to help. I listened to her pleas with the same cold smile she'd given me for 3 years. Here's what's going to happen, I told her. You're going to leave my room immediately. You're going to call Michael and tell him exactly what you did and why the wedding is canceled. You're going to explain to your family and friends that your behavior has cost your son his relationship and his inheritance. And if you ever contact me again, if you ever come near me again, I'll release every recording I have of you to social media, along with the security footage from tonight. Your precious reputation will be destroyed forever. She tried to argue, tried to negotiate, tried to offer me money to reconsider. But I was done negotiating with terrorists. The next morning brought a parade of phone calls, texts, and desperate visitors that I ignored completely. Michael showed up at my parents' house around noon, looking like he hadn't slept at all. My father answered the door and told him I didn't want to see him. Through the window, I watched the man I'd thought I'd spend my life with break down on our front porch, begging to speak with me, promising he could fix everything if I'd just give him a chance. Part of me felt sorry for him. He was as much a victim of his mother's manipulation as I was, but I knew that as long as Patricia was in his life, she'd always be in mine. He'd had 3 years to choose between us, and he'd chosen her every single time. The wedding venue was contacted, the guests were informed, and the deposits were forfeited. The Hartwell family had to explain to 300 people why the wedding of the year had been canceled 12 hours before the ceremony. I heard through mutual friends that Patricia told people I'd had a nervous breakdown and couldn't handle the pressure of marrying into their family. Let her have that story. I knew the truth. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment in Manhattan, having taken a position with a firm that appreciated my skills and didn't come with toxic in-laws. Jessica called to tell me that Michael had been asking about me, wanting to know if I was dating anyone if I ever talked about him. Apparently, he'd finally realized what his mother had cost him. He says he's been in therapy, Jessica reported, dealing with his family issues. He wants to know if you'd be willing to talk. I listened to this update while sipping wine and looking out at the city skyline from my corner office. Tell Michael, I said, that I hope he finds happiness. But he won't find it with me. That evening, I signed the final papers making my charitable foundation the primary beneficiary of my estate. The foundation focuses on helping women escape toxic relationships and rebuild their lives. It's named the Patricia Foundation, not after Michael's mother, but after my grandmother, who taught me that a woman should never let anyone make her smaller than she was meant to be. 6 months after the wedding that never was, I met David at a charity gala in Boston. He was kind, funny, and when I told him about Patricia and the wedding dress, his response was perfect. Sounds like you dodged a bullet and a crazy person. Want to dance? We've been together for 2 years now, and when he proposed last month, the first thing he said was, I already talked to my mom, and she's promised to stay completely out of the wedding planning. She's actually terrified of you after I told her what happened with Patricia. I laughed until I cried, because that's exactly the kind of mother-in-law I deserve. One who respects boundaries and knows better than to mess with a woman who's already proven what happens when you push her too far. My new wedding dress is even more beautiful than the first one, and this time, it's hanging safely in my own closet, protected by a man who understands that marriage is about 2 people, not an entire extended family's dysfunction. Patricia taught me the most valuable lesson of my adult life. Never let anyone convince you that their love comes with conditions that require you to sacrifice your dignity. Some people will try to destroy you just to prove they can. But sometimes, when they do, they end up giving you exactly the freedom you needed to become who you were always meant to be.